Hello, and thank you for watching this presentation. I sincerely appreciate the opportunity to share our work on the relation between diet and mental health. So specifically today, I'm going to share with you the findings of 3/4 reviews that my colleagues and I did in the past few years, examining the relation between diet and mental health from the disease perspective as well as from the positive psychological perspective. But before I do that, I would like to thank my sponsors that partially supported this project, my colleagues, as well as the students for their collaboration. And I also want to share a disclaimer that my purpose here today is not to make any dietary recommendations or tell you what to eat and what not to eat. I'm simply here to provide scientific evidence on the relation between meat consumption and mental health from diet disease perspective and diet health perspective. So there are a couple of reasons for investigating this topic. One reason is that in the past century, there has been a substantial increase in mental health disorders. In 2017, the WHO, World Health Organization, reported that mental illness was the leading cause of disability worldwide. And they estimated that over 300 million people suffer from depression and over 260 million suffer from anxiety. So people have been engaging in a variety of behaviors to prevent and even treat these mental health disorders. And here is the second reason for why this is important, where in order to treat this mental health disorders, people have been engaging in dietary restrictions, which has also become more prevalent and popular worldwide. And people omit various foods, not only to become healthier, but also they adopt a vegan lifestyle and vegetarian diets for ethical reasons, environmental, religious, and animal rights related reasons. And there are many categories of vegetarian diets, and they vary in what foods they exclude and include. So lacto, for example, lacto-vegetarians, lacto-ovo-vegetarians, pescatarians, and flexitarians or semi-vegetarians, and finally vegans, which are diets or a vegan diet that exclude any food containing animal products such as meat, poultry, fish, eggs, and dairy. So people have been altering their dietary patterns to prevent or even treat these mental and physical disorders. But the question is this a good idea? Is this healthy? Well, the evidence on whether abstaining from meat is healthy has been contradictory. On the one side, some studies suggest that vegetarians have better mental health. They report fewer negative emotions, lower anxiety, and better mood than meat eaters. On the other hand, however, there has been an increasing evidence that over time, individuals who abstain from animal-based foods may suffer from nutritional deficiency. They also report poorer physical, mental health, and are more likely to suffer from major depression and anxiety, as well as engage in different forms of self-harm, such as suicide, compared to meat eaters. So given this contradictory evidence, there is a need for clarity. So the purpose of our reviews was to first determine the qualitative relation between meat consumption and a variety of psychological variables, first from the disease center perspective. And then we also wanted to find some of the reasons for this conflicting evidence. And then our next purpose was to, after the systematic review, whenever we found qualitative relation, we also wanted to determine what is the actual quantitative relation between meat consumption and mental health from diet disease model. So in order to So first, we performed, like I said, systematic review and then followed up with a meta-analysis. So we searched specifically 5 online databases, such as PubMed, CNIL, Medline, Cochrane Library, and PsycInfo. We used a broad set of key terms for primary studies that examine psychological health in meat eaters and meat abstainers. We only included studies that had specific criteria, such as, for example, they had to focus on well-defined psychological constructs, such as depression, anxiety, and there had to be a clear distinction between who are meat eaters and who are meat abstainers. And of course, for meta-analysis, there had to be enough statistical information for us to be able to determine the quantitative relations, such as means and standard deviations. We also excluded studies where meat consumption was examined on a continuous level or multi-level variable, such as to what extent do you eat meat or how frequently do you eat meat, and studies from which we were unable to acquire statistical information. So we found over 7,000 initially irrelevant articles, and of course then we removed them due to the duplicates. And after omitting the irrelevant studies based on the title and the abstract, we ended up with a little bit over 100 studies. And from these, then we further omitted them based on the specific inclusion-exclusion criteria. And for the purpose of our systematic review, we found 20 articles. So afterwards, we extracted the relevant information from these 20 studies that included the design, participant characteristics, and of course, the main findings. So an important aspect of both systematic review and meta-analysis was to assess study quality or methodological rigor assessment. So we used a 100-point scale that was developed specifically for the purpose of our studies. And we evaluated all aspects of the study. So they ranged from high to low rigor with a high to very low confidence in results. So in our qualitative analysis, so systematic review, we determined primary outcomes that included depression and anxiety. So we can see here that 9 studies included in the meat eaters, they had lower depression and anxiety, and 2 studies favored meat abstainers or vegetarians and vegans. And an important point here that I want to mention is that majority of the studies favoring meat consumers were high and moderate in quality, and the 2 studies that favored vegans and vegetarians were low quality studies. So I'm not so sure if you can see here in the bottom. So favoring meat eaters is 9 studies, favoring meat abstainers is 2 studies. The secondary outcomes were self-harm, mood, stress perception, quality of life, as well as well-being. So we had 4 studies favored meat eaters and were moderate quality, and 3 studies favored vegans and vegetarians and were all low quality studies. And then following up with our meta-analysis that confirm our qualitative findings. So for every study that was included in the review, we calculated the strength of the relation between diet and depression and anxiety. So meta-analysis includes only the 2 primary mental health disorders, depression and anxiety. So the strength of this relation is known as the effect size. So what we see here is a forest plot that depicts that specific quantitative relation between depression and diet. And studies here are organized or arranged from high quality on the top and low quality on the bottom. And on the right-hand side here, we see the squares, and the squares represent the effect size, the strength of the relation between diet and depression, specifically in this graph, as well as their associated 95% confidence interval with those whiskers going through the boxes. And we see that the higher the quality of studies, the stronger and more consistent inverse relation between meat consumption and depression. And we can also see a clear tide pattern in the high moderate quality studies, whereas studies with a low quality, the squares or the findings are less consistent. You can see they are kind of all over the place. And then when taking into account all the studies, we see the overall effect is noted here in the bottom with a diamond. And the higher and more positive the number, the more positive the findings favoring meat eaters. So the squares on the right are favoring meat eaters, and the squares on the left are favoring meat abstainers. And the same patterns were observed for anxiety. So the stronger, more consistent inverse relation between meat consumption and anxiety, meaning that eating meat is associated with lower anxiety. So an important part of our reviews was study quality or study rigor. And to assess the impact of study quality, we performed meta-regression. And what you see here is what I call a bubble plot, showing a relation between the quality score on the x-axis from 0 to 100, and the effect size on the y-axis, HGG. And the circles, or those bubbles, represent the studies, each study. So what we see here is a positive relation depicting with a regression line between quality score and effect sizes. So the higher the study quality, the more positive the inverse relation between eating meat and depression. So the sizes of the circles denote the within study variance. So the larger the sample of the study, the smaller the circle, and vice versa. The larger the circle, the smaller the sample size within the study. And the same pattern was observed for the anxiety. So now switching gears a little bit. So a great deal of research has been done on the association between diet and psychological health from the disease-centered perspective. So while this specific model perspective definitely offers insights into diet-disease associations, it renders science poorly equipped to understand diet-health relations and information on the origin or genesis potentially, as well as the maintenance of positive psychological health. In fact, WHO defines health not as merely an absence of disease, but a state of complete mental and social well-being. So recently, there have been an increasing focus, or has been an increasing focus, on identifying health-promoting factors such as optimism, grit, resilience, life satisfaction, self-esteem. So our next review or reviews first review was scoping review, because we wanted to find out or identify what is out there on this relation. We wanted to look at the breadth of the literature on meat consumption and positive psychological functioning. So the process of the article searches was the same as described before. We looked at online databases using the broad set of keywords. Of course, now we looked at only positive psychological functioning or health. And we found over 10,000 relevant articles. And then after we, of course, excluded duplicates, and we omitted articles based on the abstract and the title, as well as our inclusion-exclusion criteria, and we had 13 met those conditions. So our results of the primary outcomes that included life satisfaction, self-esteem, positive mental health, and vigor. So we have, as you can see here, a little less clear results comparing to the diet-disease relation findings. So we had 2 studies that favored meat eaters, no studies favored vegans, vegetarians, and 7 studies found that no significant association between this relation. The results for the secondary outcomes included optimism, psychological well-being, positive emotions, and meaning in life. And as you can also see, again, less clear findings. 1 study favored meat eaters, no significant findings on most of the studies on these outcomes, and 0 studies favored meat abstainers. We also performed meta-analysis on this relation on the specifically primary outcomes only, because we only had enough studies for the positive mental health, satisfaction with life, as well as self-esteem. So the preliminary results that I'm sharing here, we found that meat consumption was associated with greater positive mental health, showing a small but significant effect size, while there were no significant findings between the groups on self-esteem and life satisfaction. So in sum, from the diet disease model, we saw that there is a clear evidence that being a vegetarian is associated with higher rates of depression, anxiety, as well as self-harm. And the results in respect to positive psychological functioning were definitely less clear. And then our quantitative evidence also showed that we performed a sub-analysis that I did not show you, that vegans experienced higher depression comparing to meat eaters, not only vegetarians, but also vegans. And then we also did sub-analysis for between males and females, and we found no differences in any of these relations. And then finally, we showed that higher the study quality, the more positive the benefits of eating meat. So in terms of the strengths and limitations of the studies, we found that the most rigorous studies use objective assessments for mental health, or they use multiple measures that included physician-diagnosed conditions, prescribed medications, and then self-reported symptoms as well as behaviors. The most rigorous studies also had large representative matched samples, while less rigorous studies use biased recruitment and sampling strategies. And then one limitation of all studies was the use of self-reported questionnaires, which is really not a good way to measure pretty much any variable because of the potential misreporting, social desirability, reactivity, false memories. And then many studies also did not include important information on potential co-founding variables such as race, ethnicity, religion, as well as lifestyle behaviors such as smoking, alcohol, physical activity, which definitely directly affect health and physiologic determinants of dietary intake. And then finally, most studies were correlational in nature, and therefore, we are unable to make any temporal or any causal evidence, or excuse me, inferences. So our reviews had few strengths. First, there was our decision to only select studies that have that clear distinction between meat eaters and meat abstainers. Psychological outcomes were, in some reviews, were limited only to a well-defined, the most prevalent disorders, such as depression and anxiety. And we had over 170,000 participants from several geographic regions, where we are definitely able to provide more generalizable and definitive conclusions. There are, of course, as always, some limitations, such as exclusion of non-English language studies. And we also excluded many studies on this topic because our focus was on only that clear distinction between meat eaters and meat abstainers, as well as focus only on psychological variables. There were many studies where they examined, for example, just health, and they did not mention whether it's a psychological health, physical health, so we were unable to include them. And many studies combined actually physical and psychological health. So based on our findings, we have few recommendations. So researchers should definitely use more objective assessments, preferably for physician-diagnosed disorders. The use of probability sampling strategies is definitely more preferable over convenience. Reporting detailed health-related histories would allow researchers to explore potential important and unanswered questions. And then finally, instead of using correlational and observational studies, researchers should use more rigorous study designs, such as randomized controlled trials. So to sum up, our findings do not support vegetarianism and veganism as a strategy to benefit psychological health. Feel free to read about our 3 studies, systematic review, meta-analysis on diet disease model, and then also diet health model on scoping review.